In June 1941, when the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, the Red Army was armed primarily with Model 1891 Mosin Nagant rifles. Ironically, the gun's most significant period of service was achieved after it was technically obsolete as a frontline weapon. Unlike the SVT, the Mosin Nagant could digest the poorest quality ammunition and would keep firing as long as the riflemen had the strength to work the bolt. For all its admirable qualities, it could not provide a high volume of fire. And Soviet designs for rapid-fire semi-automatic rifles, primarily the Tokarev SVT-38 and SVT-40, had proved disappointing.
The Tokarev 1938 and 1940 rifles were not quite efficient in dust and dirt or a rapid change of temperature, and failed to prove reliable enough under battlefield conditions.
Between the wars, the Soviets had experimented with small-caliber, high-velocity submachine guns. But conservative army leaders, clinging to the idea of individual marksmanship, never regarded them as particularly useful. Now, in the midst of a national emergency, it was decided that the bullet-spraying submachine gun, however small, would become a major fighting weapon. Ultimately, the Red Army fielded more submachine guns than any other country during the Second World War.
The priority was, what is the quickest and cheapest thing we can make? And the answer to that was submachine guns. Rifles demanded a specialist rifle factory. Ivan's garage and Joe's engineering workshops, they were all put on to making submachine guns as hard as they could go.
In 1934, Vasily Degtyarev had designed the PPD, the first submachine gun adopted by the Soviet military. But numerous design and production defects gave reason for senior Army officials to withdraw it from service in 1939. Degtyarev substantially modified the gun, creating the PPD-40. A significant feature of the new version was its chrome-lined barrel. This refinement made the barrel nearly impervious to neglect. It is a feature the Russians have continued to use on practically all of their automatic and selective fire weapons. However, the Degtyarev PPD-40 was never produced in large numbers. It would fall to another design, by Georgy Shpagin, to face the German onslaught. Shpagin's gun, the PPSh-41, was optimized for mass production. Later versions featured a 35-round box magazine. There was no selector switch. It fired only on full auto. It was the first Soviet small arm to use stamped and welded parts, requiring less machining time for completion. The PPSh, as it was called by the Russians, was ridiculed for being crude and resembling a farm implement, but over 6 million were made. By 1944, one company in every infantry regiment was armed entirely with PPSHs. Disregarding their own casualties, swarm attacks with submachine guns became a favored Soviet tactic. Images of Red Army soldiers brandishing their PPShs became an icon of what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. In 1942, based on the extraordinary success of the PPSH, the Soviet leadership issued specifications for a new submachine gun. It had to be simpler to operate and easier to assemble than the PPSH, but no less effective. Most parts had to be stamped or pressed from hot-rolled steel. excessive trimming and shaping was not permitted, and the average production time was not to exceed 3.5 hours. Only one gun met all the requirements, the PPS.
You've got a big hammer press, and you put a piece of bare sheet metal in it, and it comes down, and wham, and there you have the part. Simple as that, and probably does it more quickly than it takes me to tell about it.
The PPS would play an extraordinary role in the Great Patriotic War. By early September 1941, Russia's second largest city, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, had been completely encircled by 2 German armies. In October, the population began to die of starvation. For 900 days, the city endured constant air and artillery bombardment. Supplies were cut off, except for a treacherous corridor across frozen Lake Ladoga. Food was severely rationed. Within the city's defense perimeter, workers at the Voskov Instrument Factory produced the first PPS submachine guns under the personal direction of the designer, Alexei Sudayev. Guns went straight from the factory to the front lines. The first field trials for the weapon were carried out in combat. Fortunately, the PPS succeeded from the beginning, and the weapon became a vital factor in the defense of the city. By the time the Red Army broke the siege in January 1944, over 1 million Russian civilians had been killed or starved to death. Their story was transformed into an almost mythic symbol of Soviet tenacity and resolve. If ever a particular event was identified with a particular firearm, it would certainly be the Siege of Leningrad and the PPS.